Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're doing really well. My name's James, welcome to Divers Ready, and welcome to the next in our series of videos that we call Quick Tips, where I try and cram as much of my scuba diving knowledge as possible into a video 5 minutes or less on a given subject. Now, the next 6 Quick Tips videos are all going to be on the same broad subject, and that is regulators, because I've been realizing through the questions that you guys have been asking that there's actually a big hole in my video catalog that I haven't covered, where the regulator is just not covered in enough detail. So we're going to go into super fine detail, and I'm going to break down a standard set of regulators into all of its component parts and make a video on each. This, the first of those 6 videos, is going to be focused on the basics of the first stage of the regulator. So as always, you guys make your next dive on our subscribe button down there, hit that little bell icon while I go over to the workbench and get set up. Right, so here we have a standard recreational regulator setup. We have a first stage, we have 2 second stages attached by hoses, one designated as a primary, one as a secondary, alternative or octo, and I have an LPI hose to inflate my BCD, and just a plain brass and glass SPG so I can read my tank pressure. Also in this instance, I also have a tank pressure transmitter. So that's the basic setup, and what we're going to focus on today is the first stage. So I've got a couple here to go through with you. We're going to talk about the job of the first stage regulator. We're going to go through the glossary of terms for the different parts, and then I'm going to give you some buyer advice so that the next time you go in to buy a regulator at your local dive shop and the salesperson is talking about HFP ports and turrets, you have some understanding of that terminology, and it's going to make you a more informed buyer. Let's start then with what a first stage regulator does, and to explain that we need to talk about the regulator system in general. So if you were to try and breathe straight from your scuba cylinder, it would be pretty much impossible. It'd be like trying to drink from a fire hose. Just too much pressure. So we need a regulator to regulate the pressure and reduce it down to what we call ambient pressure, which is the pressure at which we're diving at any given depth. And that is done by the scuba regulator in 2 stages, hence first stage and second stage. The first stage is the part of the regulator that attaches directly to the scuba cylinder and reduces cylinder pressure down to an intermediary pressure, a medium pressure. That can be somewhere in the 125 to 150 psi range, depending on which brand of regulator you go with. That's somewhere between 10 and 15 bar. That intermediary pressure is then distributed through ports to a range of different hoses to provide different functions, some that you breathe off of, some used for inflating your buoyancy compensating device. It also transmits the accurate pressure of the cylinder with no regulation whatsoever to your high pressure ports so that you get an accurate read of your cylinder pressure on your SPG. So to put that in broader terms then, the first stage is receiving high pressure from the cylinder and distributing gas out to the different hoses at different pressures. High pressure for your transmitters and your SPGs, and an intermediary pressure, a medium pressure, out to your second stage regulators that go in your mouth that you breathe from, and to your inflator hoses. And it does it in one of 2 different ways, and that's why I've got these specific regulators here to show you. This is a Scuba Pro Mark II, this is an Apex XTX50. This is a piston regulator. It operates via a piston mechanism. This one operates via a diaphragm mechanism. Now, we don't have time in this video to get into the pros and cons of each, but that video will be coming up in this mini series of quick tips videos on the scuba regulator. We will do a breakdown of the pros and cons of piston versus diaphragm. But all you need to know is that there are 2 different mechanisms by which a first stage reduces the pressure in the cylinder down to the intermediary pressure. Let's talk a little bit about the materials that the regulator is made from. 95%, probably higher than that, of all first stages are machined brass that are then chrome plated. The chrome plating gives the brass a protection against corrosion, but it's a pretty soft coating, so you want to make sure that you never put it into contact with any harder metal, like for example stainless steel, that can scratch off the coating and leave the brass underneath exposed. You can even buy regulators, first stage regulators, that are machined out of solid titanium that go up to like $2,000 or $3,000. They're incredibly deluxe, but they don't do a better job in my opinion. So just stick with a nice brass chrome plated first stage, and as you can see, there's a few little plastic components. You're going to see some rubber and some silicone that are used to transmit the pressure to the inside. We'll also talk about balanced versus unbalanced first stages in a future quick tips video. Let's now go through a glossary of terms for the different parts of a first stage regulator, so the next time you go into a shop to buy one, you can speak with more authority. We've already talked about the fact that this is DIN and this is yoke, referring to the different kinds of interface that each regulator has and the type of cylinder that they can connect to. Then we can talk about obviously dust caps. With DIN you have a loose dust cap that screws on and make sure that water doesn't enter the first stage. This is a 10-cent piece of plastic protecting a $600 regulator, incredibly important. And you've also got an attached dust cap on the yoke, which is basically just on there with a little collar and protects water going into the first stage and is held in place by the yoke screw. So then you have all these little buttons here, which are the ports. Okay, I've taken the actual port plugs out of this Apex regulator. They look like this. They're a little button with an Allen key fixture and an O-ring, and you'll see that the ports themselves are marked either HP for high pressure or not marked at all, and therefore presumed to be intermediary pressure. High HP is suitable for plugging in your pressure gauges and your transmitters where you want the true cylinder value, and everything else, your inflator hoses and your second stages, gets plugged into an IP port. You will also see on some regulators, these don't have it, but you'll see HFP next to an intermediary port. That stands for high flow port. So it's just a little wider diameter. The intermediary pressure will be the same, but the volume can be greater. It can deliver more gas. And those are the recommended ports that you screw your second stage into. The position and orientation of the port plugs allow for what is called hose routing options. In other words, how do you want your hoses to come out of the regulator? You want them obviously to be in the most ergonomical design so they're not creating trim hazards. So when you're buying a regulator, one of the things they'll talk about is port placement. Where the ports are on the first stage, when this is connected to the cylinder, where will your hoses be routed through? And that brings us to this bad boy over here, which has what's called a turret. A turret is just a rotating cap on the end of a first stage, which allows you to move it around and position the ports exactly where you want based on the needs. You can also get on this one an additional port on the end if you wanted to use it for side mount and have a hose coming directly off of the first stage. That's about it for the glossary of terms for the parts of a first stage regulator. Let's go on and talk about how to buy an actual first stage. Let me give you some buyer's advice. So depending on the manufacturer you're looking at, a first stage will either be paired with a second stage, or you'll be able to buy just the first stage on its own, or you may have a range of different options for a second stage that it can be paired with. Again, Scuba Pro, they tend to put out 5 or 6 different first stages and maybe 8 or 10 different second stages at any given time, and there's a certain amount of mix and match that you can go on to buy a set together. In the box, you're going to get a first stage, a hose, and a second stage. That's it. Then you need to add an opto to it, you need to add your SPG to it, you need to add your transmitters, whatever else you're going to use. The inflator hose is normally sold with the BCD, and that just screws on with a universal thread to any brand of regulator. So if you buy a Scuba Pro first stage, it doesn't mean you have to buy a Scuba Pro BCD. That is pretty much. So can we then mix and match, for example, an Apex second stage with a Scuba Pro first stage? Well, yes and no. It entirely depends on the IP that the first stage is kicking out. If the IP is too high for the second stage, the reg is going to free flow. If it's too low for the second stage, it's going to give a harder breathe. So you do want to make sure they're compatible. That being said, there is a very small range of IPs that first stages across all manufacturers actually kick out. So there's a good chance that it's compatible, but the best practice is always to make sure through an authorized service technician that you can sort of cross-match first and second stages. In my opinion, best practice would always be to use the same brand second stage with its given first stage. Trouble comes then when you start to look around the second-hand market and people have Frankensteined regs together. You're going to want to be careful of that if you're buying off of sort of second-hand marketplaces. Always, if you're buying a regulator that isn't brand new, make sure the first thing you do as soon as the deal is done is take it straight to an authorized service technician, regardless of what the guy selling it told you. Make sure you get it fully serviced. This is, after all, life support equipment. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this helps you. The idea behind this video is that the next time you go to buy a regulator, you're going to be able to speak with more authority because you've now got a really solid understanding of the basics of the first stage, the components, a glossary of terms, and at the end of the day, hopefully that helps you make a more educated decision and protect the investment that you make in your dive gear. The next quick tips in this series of videos, we're going to talk about piston versus diaphragm regulators. Then we'll go on to talk about balanced versus unbalanced first stages. We'll talk about hose materials, if braided or rubber are better, which I prefer. Then we'll get to the second stage. We'll go through a glossary for that. We'll go through the function and so on and so forth. So really in depth. We do already have a couple of videos on quick tips, which I will put over there on how to change a mouthpiece and the difference between yoke and din. So we can kind of tack those onto this little mini series. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already. And I'll see you on the next one. Dive safe, dive often.